The DNA myth. Millions of people take DNA tests every year. They open their results expecting answers, only to find a giant circle spread across the map of Britain and Ireland. One label, one category, British and Irish. It looks simple. It suggests that the English, Welsh, Scots, and Irish are all part of one enormous genetic family. And in some ways, that is true, but ancient DNA has uncovered a much more complicated story. A story of migrations, invasions, isolation, and survival stretching back thousands of years. Because if these nations share the same islands, why do modern genetic studies still identify them as distinct populations? Why does a person from rural Wales often cluster differently from someone in eastern England? Why do parts of Ireland preserve genetic signatures that seem to reach back into the Bronze Age? And why did Scotland follow a path unlike either of them? The answers lie beneath castles, beneath kingdoms, and even beneath recorded history itself. They begin long before England existed, long before Scotland, Wales, or Ireland had names. At the edge of Europe, hidden in the mist, lie these islands. For thousands of years they stood at the end of the known world. Empires rose and vanished. Languages were born and forgotten. Entire peoples disappeared into history. Yet they left something behind, not just monuments, not just ruins, not just legends. They left traces of themselves in the DNA of the people living there today. And thanks to modern genetics, those traces can still be read. This is the story of how 4 nations emerged from a shared prehistoric past. The story of the English, the Welsh, the Scots, and the Irish, and the ancient migrations that shaped them all. Before we go deeper, take a second to like the video and subscribe, because what you're about to discover will completely change how you see British and Irish ancestry. Now let's begin. The first Britons. Our story begins around 12,000 years ago. The last ice age was ending. Massive glaciers that had covered northern Europe began to retreat. As the climate warmed, new landscapes opened across what would later become Britain and Ireland. At this time, Britain was not an island. A vast land bridge connected it directly to continental Europe. Across this landscape came the first pioneers. These people are known today as the Western hunter-gatherers. They lived by hunting wild animals, gathering plants, fishing rivers, and moving across the land in small groups. Ancient DNA has revealed that many of them looked very different from what people imagine when they picture early Europeans. Evidence suggests they often possessed darker skin tones than most modern Europeans, frequently combined with blue or light-colored eyes. Their genetic legacy survives today, though only as a fraction of the ancestry carried by modern populations. For thousands of years, these hunter-gatherers dominated the islands, but they would not remain alone. A revolution was approaching. Around 4000 BC, new migrants arrived from continental Europe. These newcomers traced much of their ancestry back to farming communities that had originally spread westward from Anatolia in modern Turkey. Unlike the hunter-gatherers, they brought agriculture. They cultivated crops, raised livestock, built permanent settlements, and transformed the landscape forever. These were the Neolithic farmers, where hunter-gatherers moved with the seasons. Farmers reshaped the land itself. Forests were cleared, fields appeared, villages expanded, population numbers increased dramatically, and with them came entirely new genetic lineages. These people built some of the most remarkable monuments in prehistoric Europe: massive stone circles, burial chambers, ceremonial sites. Among them was one of the most famous monuments on Earth, Stonehenge. For nearly 2,000 years, the descendants of these farmers flourished across Britain and Ireland. They seemed destined to dominate the future. But then something happened that changed everything. A migration so significant that it would rewrite the genetic history of the islands. The Great Bronze Age transformation. Around 2400 BC, a new population arrived. Archaeologists call them the Bell Beaker people, named after the distinctive pottery vessels found in their graves. But these were not merely new settlers. They represented one of the most dramatic demographic transformations ever discovered in ancient Europe. Genetic evidence suggests that these migrants carried substantial ancestry from populations linked to the Eurasian steppe. Their ancestors were skilled pastoralists who had spread across large parts of Europe during the Bronze Age. They brought new technologies, metalworking, improved mobility, new social structures, and, perhaps most importantly, they carried genetic lineages that would come to dominate Britain and Ireland. A landmark genetic study published in 2018 revealed a startling finding. Within only a few centuries, the genetic makeup of Britain changed profoundly. The ancestry associated with earlier Neolithic farming populations declined dramatically and became a much smaller component of the population that followed. Few prehistoric events have left such a clear mark in the DNA record. The people who built Stonehenge did not vanish entirely, but the genetic landscape around them was transformed. A new chapter had begun. The newcomers carried paternal lineages dominated by R1b, particularly branches that would later become extremely common throughout the Atlantic world. Many of the genetic traits associated with lighter pigmentation also became increasingly common during this period. By the end of the Bronze Age, the foundations of the modern populations of Britain and Ireland were largely in place. Yet they were still one broad family. The four nations we know today did not yet exist. That division would come later, and it would be shaped not by a single migration, but by thousands of years of geography, isolation, invasion, and survival. The first great divergence would occur in the west. To understand it, we must travel into the mountains of Wales. Wales, the mountain fortress. To understand Wales, you must first understand geography, because mountains can do something armies often cannot. They can preserve the past. While much of Britain consists of open plains and fertile lowlands, Wales is dominated by rugged mountains, deep valleys, and a dramatic coastline facing the Irish Sea. For thousands of years, these natural barriers shaped history. When new peoples arrived in Britain, they often found it easier to settle the richer lands of the East, and whenever conflict erupted, the mountains offered refuge. Again and again, communities retreated westward. Again and again, Wales became a sanctuary. This process accelerated after the Roman period. As Germanic tribes from across the North Sea began settling eastern and southern Britain, many native Britons found themselves increasingly pushed toward the Western Highlands. Here, among the mountains, older traditions endured, languages survived, customs persisted, and according to modern genetics, elements of ancient ancestry remained unusually strong. For centuries, historians debated whether the Welsh represented a direct continuation of Britain's earliest inhabitants. The reality is more complicated. No population remains unchanged over thousands of years. Every community experiences migration and mixing, yet large-scale genetic studies have revealed something remarkable. The influential people of the British Isles study found that Welsh populations form one of the most distinct genetic clusters within Britain. In many regions, especially North Wales, genetic continuity appears stronger than in much of England. Every community experiences migration and mixing, yet large-scale genetic studies have revealed something remarkable. The influential people of the British Isles study found that Welsh populations form one of the most distinct genetic clusters within Britain. In many regions, especially North Wales, genetic continuity appears stronger than in much of England. In other words, while every population changed over time, Wales preserved a particularly deep connection to earlier inhabitants of the islands. This becomes especially visible through paternal lineages. The Y chromosome lineage, R1b L21, strongly associated with Bronze Age populations of Britain and Ireland, reaches exceptionally high frequencies in Wales. Many maternal lineages also reflect long-term continuity stretching back through centuries of British history. But DNA alone does not tell the whole story. Culture matters too. The Welsh language is among the oldest living languages in Europe, despite Roman occupation. Despite Anglo-Saxon expansion, despite Norman conquest, despite centuries of political pressure, it survived. Today, road signs, schools, literature, and everyday conversations still carry echoes of a linguistic tradition that stretches back more than a millennium. In many ways, Wales represents a living bridge to Britain's ancient past, not because it remained frozen in time, but because it absorbed change more slowly than many neighboring regions. The mountains did not stop history, but they changed its speed, and because of that, the genetic and cultural story of Wales remains one of the most distinctive in Europe. Yet if Wales was protected by mountains, another nation experienced a different kind of isolation. An isolation created not by hills or valleys, but by the sea itself. Across the water lies Ireland, and its story would unfold along a very different path. Ireland, the Atlantic stronghold. For much of ancient history, Ireland stood apart. Separated from Britain by the Irish Sea and from continental Europe by even greater distances, it developed in relative isolation. This isolation mattered, because while outside influences certainly arrived, they arrived more slowly. The Roman Empire transformed much of Europe. Its armies marched through Britain. Its roads crossed the landscape. Its culture spread across vast territories, yet Rome never conquered Ireland. No Roman province emerged there. No Roman cities dominated its countryside. As a result, Ireland followed its own course. A distinctly Gaelic civilization emerged, its language flourished, its legal traditions evolved independently. Its monasteries became centers of learning that preserved knowledge during some of Europe's most turbulent centuries. Genetically, Ireland also retained strong signals of Bronze Age ancestry. The paternal lineage, R1b L21, reaches some of its highest frequencies anywhere in the world within Ireland. Particularly in Western regions, these patterns reflect deep continuity rather than complete isolation. People still migrated, trade still occurred, ideas still crossed the sea. But the scale of external influence remained smaller than in many neighboring regions. For centuries, Ireland appeared relatively secure. Then came the longships. Beginning in the late 8th century, Viking raiders emerged from Scandinavia. Their attacks shot communities across the British Isles. Monasteries were looted, settlements were attacked, coastal regions became vulnerable. Yet the Vikings did not merely raid Ireland, they settled. They established trading bases known as longforts. Over time, several of these settlements evolved into major urban centers: Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, and Cork. These became hubs of commerce connecting Ireland to wider European networks. The Norse newcomers brought fresh cultural influences, new technologies, new trade routes, and new genetic contributions. Over generations, Vikings and Gaels increasingly mixed. The result was a hybrid Norse-Gael culture unlike anything seen elsewhere. Modern genetic studies continue to identify traces of Scandinavian ancestry in parts of Ireland, particularly near former Viking settlements. Yet the overall picture remains striking. Despite centuries of interaction, Ireland retained a powerful indigenous core. The newcomers left their mark, but they never replaced the foundation. The result is one of Europe's most fascinating historical blends. An ancient Atlantic population shaped by isolation, a Gaelic civilization that flourished independently, and coastal cities forever transformed by Scandinavian adventurers. But Ireland was not the only northern land touched by Viking sails. Further north lay a region whose entire identity would emerge from the collision of multiple peoples, a land where ancient tribes, Irish migrants, and Norse settlers would all contribute to a new nation, Scotland. Before we uncover the mystery of Scotland's origins, take a moment to subscribe if you're enjoying the journey. Every week, we explore the hidden history buried beneath surnames, DNA, forgotten kingdoms, and ancient migrations. And while you're watching, leave a comment below. Which of the 4 nations do your ancestors come from? England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, or perhaps a mixture of several? I'd love to hear your family's story. Now, let's travel north into one of the most fascinating genetic landscapes in Europe, Scotland, the Northern Crucible. If Wales was a fortress and Ireland was an island stronghold, Scotland was something else entirely, a crucible, a place where different peoples met, mixed, fought, and eventually became something new. Modern Scotland occupies the northern third of Britain, but its story begins long before Scotland existed as a nation. For thousands of years, the people living north of what is now the English border followed a path distinct from the south. Ancient DNA studies suggest that even during the Bronze Age, populations in northern Britain retained genetic characteristics that differed from those farther south. This distinction became increasingly visible during the Iron Age. When Roman armies pushed northward, they encountered fierce resistance. The tribes they met were unlike any they had faced elsewhere in Britain. Roman writers describe powerful groups living beyond the frontier. Among them were the Caledonians, and later, the mysterious Picts. The Picts remain one of the great mysteries of British history. They left behind impressive stone carvings, symbols whose meanings are still debated, fortified settlements, and evidence of a sophisticated society, yet they left almost no written records of their own. Most of what we know comes from outsiders. The Romans called them Picti, often translated as the painted people. Whether they truly painted themselves or practiced forms of body decoration remains uncertain. What is clear is that they successfully resisted incorporation into the Roman world. For centuries, they remained masters of the north. Yet the Picts would not remain alone. Across the sea, another migration was underway. From northeastern Ireland came a Gaelic kingdom known as Dal Riata. Beginning in the early medieval period, Gaelic-speaking settlers established themselves along Scotland's western coast. These migrants brought their language, their culture, their traditions, and over time, their influence expanded. The newcomers became known as the Scoti. It is from their name that Scotland ultimately derives its own. For generations, Picts and Gaels coexisted, sometimes as rivals, sometimes as allies. Eventually, their identities merged. The Gaelic language spread. The Pictish kingdoms disappeared from history, and a new Scottish identity gradually emerged. But the transformation was not finished, because from the north came another force that would reshape Scotland forever: the Vikings. Norwegian seafarers began arriving during the late 8th century. At first, they came as raiders. Soon, they came as settlers. Nowhere was their impact greater than in the northern islands: Orkney, Shetland, the Hebrides. In these regions, Norse influence became profound. Archaeology, place names, language, and genetics all tell the same story. For centuries, these islands formed part of a Scandinavian world connected more closely to Norway than to mainland Scotland. Modern genetic studies suggest that Norse ancestry remains especially significant in parts of Orkney and Shetland, where it may account for roughly a quarter or more of the genetic heritage. Even today, traces of this Scandinavian legacy remain visible, not only in DNA, but in surnames, dialects, traditions, and local identity. The Scot, therefore, is not the product of a single origin. Scotland emerged from the blending of ancient northern Britons, Picts, Irish Gaels, and Norse settlers, a nation forged from multiple streams of ancestry flowing together across centuries. Yet even Scotland's complexity pales beside the transformation that occurred further south, because one region of Britain experienced a demographic shift so significant that it would help create an entirely new people. To understand that transformation, we must turn to England. England, the Great Transformation. Of all the nations within the British Isles, England has perhaps been shaped most dramatically by migration. Its geography explains why. Unlike Wales, England lacks vast mountain barriers. Unlike Ireland, it is not separated by sea. Its eastern coastline faces directly toward continental Europe. For thousands of years, it served as Britain's gateway. Ideas arrived here first, trade arrived here first, and so did invaders. Before the English existed, much of the region formed part of Roman Britain. For nearly 4 centuries, Roman rule reshaped the landscape. Roads connected distant settlements, cities expanded, trade flourished, military forts guarded frontiers. Roman influence reached into daily life. Yet one of the most surprising discoveries of modern genetics is that the Roman period appears to have left a smaller long-term genetic impact than many once assumed. Although migrants from across the Roman Empire certainly lived in Britain, their overall contribution appears modest compared with later population movements. The true turning point came after Rome's departure. In 410 AD, Roman administration collapsed. The legions withdrew, power fragmented, and across the North Sea, new migrants began arriving. Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, groups originating from regions that now form parts of Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. For generations, historians argued about what happened next. Did a small warrior elite simply seize power? Or did large numbers of settlers migrate into Britain? The debate continued for decades. Then ancient DNA changed everything. By comparing the genomes of ancient skeletons with modern populations, researchers gained an unprecedented view of the past. The results suggested that Anglo-Saxon migration involved substantial population movement. Particularly in eastern England, in some regions, studies indicate that ancestry associated with these migrants eventually accounted for roughly 30 to 50% of the genetic makeup. This was not merely a political change, it was a demographic transformation. The newcomers brought languages that would evolve into English, they established kingdoms, created new social structures, and introduced genetic contributions that remain visible today. Certain paternal lineages associated with continental northwestern Europe became more common. Variants associated with lighter pigmentation also increased in frequency within some regions. Yet the story was not one of complete replacement. Native Britons remained, communities mixed, cultures merged. The modern English population emerged from this interaction between incoming Germanic settlers and the earlier inhabitants of Britain. Then came another wave, the Vikings. But these Vikings differed from those who transformed parts of Scotland and Ireland. Many came from Denmark, and unlike earlier raiders, they conquered territory on a massive scale. By the 9th century, a vast area of England fell under Scandinavian control. This region became known as the Danelaw. Here, Norse customs, laws, language, and genetics added another layer to England's evolving identity. Place names ending in by and thorpe still reveal this legacy. Today, centuries later, came yet another transformation, the Norman conquest of 1066. Although its genetic impact appears smaller than the Anglo-Saxon migrations, its political and cultural consequences were enormous. A new ruling elite emerged, the English language changed, society was reorganized, and England entered a new chapter of history. The English, therefore, are neither purely Celtic nor purely Germanic. They are a synthesis, a population shaped by ancient Britons, Anglo-Saxon settlers, Viking influence, and centuries of interaction with continental Europe. Their story reflects England's role as Britain's bridge to the wider world. The final picture. 4 nations, 1 archipelago. At first glance, the map seems simple. England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, clear borders, distinct identities, separate histories. Yet beneath the surface lies a far more complicated reality. The Welsh preserve some of the strongest signals of ancient British continuity. The Irish retain deep roots connected to the Atlantic world while carrying the legacy of Viking cities. The Scots emerged from the blending of Picts, Gaels, and Norse settlers. The English became a synthesis of ancient Britons and successive migrations from across the North Sea. Each nation followed its own path. Each developed its own culture, its own language, its own identity. Yet all of them began with the same prehistoric foundations. All of them inherited something from the first hunter-gatherers who crossed into these islands after the Ice Age. All of them carry echoes of the farmers who built monuments across the landscape. All of them bear traces of the Bronze Age migrations that transformed Britain forever. Modern DNA has not divided these peoples. If anything, it has revealed how deeply connected they truly are. The differences are real, but so are the shared origins. The story of Britain and Ireland is not a story of separate beginnings. It is a story of common roots branching in different directions across thousands of years. Every family tree reflects that journey. Every surname carries part of that legacy. Every strand of DNA preserves fragments of countless lives that came before. The map may divide us into English, Welsh, Scottish, and Irish, but beneath the skin, we remain chapters of the same ancient story. A story written over 12,000 years, a story of migration, adaptation, survival, and identity. A story that is still being discovered today. If you enjoyed this journey through the genetic history of Britain and Ireland, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future documentaries. And now I'd like to hear from you. Which nation appears in your family history? Do your ancestors come from England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, or a mixture of several? And what did your DNA test reveal? Share your story in the comments below. Some of the most fascinating discoveries often come from the experiences of viewers like you. Thank you for watching. And until next time, keep exploring the hidden history that lives all around us.